Hey, Costa. Just to begin, I was hoping you'd tell us a little bit about yourself and what interested you in telling stories about sustainable agriculture and land management.
Yeah, so I've always I've always done filmmaking as a kid. Made a lot of skateboard videos, and like a lot of kids, like a lot of millennials, I think we had so many tools to like make videos, put them on YouTube, and it wasn't such a big deal. And as I got into college, I started to realize that, you could really make a living
Mm-hmm.
making films and making documentaries specifically. And I think also my generation, I was part of, kind of a group of people who were really kind of affected by like peak oil and
Yeah.
these other apocalyptic scenarios, and that kind of got me into farming and survival skills and kind of
Mm-hmm.
thinking about, what's a good, what characters in Mad Max are we going to be basically,
Seriously.
and and I think that often leads to a lot of things like farming and
Mm-hmm.
then kind of sustainable design, and permaculture, which is what I made my
Yeah.
first documentary about.
Okay, cool.
So permaculture is kind of like a design. It's like a design science that looks at like how do we redesign society to really work with the Earth's systems,
Mm-hmm.
to make another definition for permaculture is common sense. So I was really attracted to this idea of kind of like it's not a doomsday scenario, it's just like a redesign scenario.
Mm.
We really need to
Yeah.
think about just tweaking the way we're basically getting our needs met. And one of the things I liked about permaculture was this concept of having a positive impact or having a positive footprint.
Sure.
A lot of the environmental movement tends to say like you need to have less impact and smaller
Mm-hmm.
footprint, and you need to disappear, and if you die that actually would be better because then you'd have, and it kind
Yeah.
of gets in
It
this,
does kind of sound like
a little
that.
bit of a this direction. So I
Mm-hmm.
was really attracted to this idea of how can we actually have a really good impact
Yeah.
and have not feel so bad about ourselves
Yeah.
existing. So
Exactly.
that's kind of what really inspired me to make my first film, the kind of that
Mm-hmm.
flipping that environmental narrative a little bit.
Yeah. Very cool. Yeah, permaculture is awesome. I went down like a rabbit hole a few months ago on permaculture and regenerative agriculture, and yeah, like you said, it was just kind of like it seemed like it would be common sense, but so much of the way that we do agriculture today is really not common sense. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's neat.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's capitalism, so
Yep,
it doesn't make
capitalism, man.
it doesn't make any actual logic. It just makes money.
Yeah,
So that
exactly.
that's kind of what happens. But I mean,
Mm-hmm.
like you're saying, you get interested in these things, you go down a rabbit hole. For me, as someone who had film skills and video production skills, I realized that when you show up with a camera, people love to tell you all about what they're doing.
Yeah.
And for me, I really wanted to learn a lot more about permaculture and kind of what it looked like around the world, or
Mm-hmm.
at least around the country at that point. And so I just started traveling and talking to people on their
Mm.
farms, and that's kind of what I realized is a way to learn. Is a documentary is really a great way to learn.
Yeah,
And you get exposed to a lot of stuff and get to
I
form a
bet.
lot of relationships with people.
That's cool.
So it's and journalism and all kinds of anything that has to do with talking to people. It's
Yeah.
really like free education.
Yeah, totally. Does that kind of lead to how you got started on this documentary, Inhabitants?
Yeah, totally. I mean, there's a thread through the permaculture movement and the permaculture, kind of the textbooks and some of the literature
Mm-hmm.
that kind of talks about indigenous wisdom and indigenous knowledge and how that's
Yeah.
kind of informed some of the permaculture principles. And it's kind of talked about and then kind of forgotten about, and it doesn't often lead to like, okay, and now let's go to this tribal community, or let's actually talk to these tribal people and look at
Mm.
the projects they're doing and actually learn from them. And it tends to be left out from that movement. And
Okay.
when I looked more into the history of permaculture, like Bill Mollison and some other folks were actually learning from the Aborigines of
Yeah.
Australia,
Mm-hmm.
from the Aboriginal people, and they were learning about prescribed fire, they were learning about food forestry, all these
Mm-hmm.
things that people don't realize are indigenous practices. So that kind of realizing that after I'd made that first film and thinking more
Yeah.
about is there a way I could support more of those Native voices to talk about some of their traditions and,
Mm-hmm.
how that's been really co-opted into a lot of movements. So that was kind of in the back of my head for a while.
Gotcha.
And my partner, Anna, was working in the Southwest with tribes doing climate change planning, resilience
Okay.
planning with the USDA. And, it was through her partnerships that I started talking to some of the folks she was working with. And
Mm-hmm.
we kind of naturally formed some relationships with people. And one of the conversations that would keep coming up was kind of like, we need more media, we need more documentation.
Okay.
We need to be, showing the world in a better way right now, in a faster way,
Yeah.
what we're doing. And so it kind of became this collaborative effort. And we, basically through our friendships with these folks, we just
Mm-hmm.
kind of slowly built this project. And it's been about 4 years
Oh, wow. Okay.
coming together. Yeah.
Cool. So, specifically, like what the documentary is about. I know you were like visiting with different indigenous peoples around the country, but could you tell me a little bit more about who exactly you were following around?
Yeah. Yeah. So the goal of the film was to basically uplift, Native voices around land stewardship.
Yeah.
And we wanted to look at land stewardship across the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
In the main bioregions. There's kind of, the film looks at the eastern forests and the
Mm.
plains, the western drier forests, Hawaii,
Yeah.
more of a coastal community, and then the southwest, really in the desert. So we basically visited 5 communities over the course of 2 years, going back to each one.
Okay.
And
Cool.
starting in the east, the Menominee up in Wisconsin, who
Mm-hmm.
have one of the longest running sustainable forestry
Oh, cool.
management systems like in the world. Yeah,
Hmm.
they've been doing it for a long time. And
Not know that.
yeah, they're really fascinating. There's been a lot of research showing that they actually have more standing timber in their forest than they did 200 years ago,
What?
but they've been logging their forest for 200 years. They
Wow.
somehow have more standing timber. So, there's a lot to talk about with them, but
Yeah.
I could recommend a lot of great research about them. And their main focus is looking at the diversity of trees is what makes
Mm.
it so strong. And today, a lot of forestry, or industrial forestry, looking
Yeah.
at growing trees as having one kind of tree
It's a
for thousands of
monoculture.
miles. Yeah,
Yeah.
totally.
Yeah. Yikes.
And yeah, and then so the Blackfeet are the Blackfeet tribe out in the plains of
Mm-hmm.
Montana are
Okay.
restoring buffalo back to the plains. The Hopi tribe down in northern Arizona are continuing and restoring their dryland farming, which is
Mm-hmm.
basically farming without water at all,
Okay.
which
Wow.
is pretty hard to wrap your head around.
Yeah.
And we're still kind of understanding how, but a lot of that processes has to do with adapting seeds to be able to live in drought
Oh,
and
okay.
planting them deeper and deeper and deeper so they can access really low water, but just really, 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 fascinating ways of working with plants over thousands of years to be able to deal with
Mm-hmm.
that climate really well, which is something
Wow.
that our modern agriculture is not really taking advantage of at
Yeah.
all, or even grappling with. And then we spent time with the Kurdic tribe up in Northern California, who are bringing back prescribed fire
Okay.
to the landscape to help not only make their communities safer by
Mm-hmm.
creating these safe dead zones around their community, so when a wildfire does come, it can't enter because they've already
Mm-hmm.
burned, but also it really increases all the wild food supply for animals, and also increases things like huckleberries and acorns
Okay.
and mushrooms. And
Huh.
so there's a whole host of reasons people should be doing prescribed burning if they live
Yeah.
in California. And then the last community that we spent time with was in Hawaii, where they're trying to bring back these food forests, which are
Mm.
like multi-dimensional food forests that were completely wiped out mostly by Monsanto, where
Yeah.
Monsanto does
It's
a lot
funny
of
how they
those.
tend to pop up in a lot of places.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, they actually went out to Hawaii really early in their development, Monsanto,
Mm-hmm.
because they knew they would have less regulation out there. Hawaii
Okay.
has a lot different laws. And also because they bought up a lot of land really early on, so they do a lot of their chemical testing out there. And there's a great film called Island Earth that actually looks really specifically at kind of Monsanto's chemical testing and how it's affecting Native people. It's pretty insane.
Yeah.
So yeah, we try to paint kind of a wide swath of what's going on across the country, as a way to kind of highlight, the main places that people live, and they could understand and relate to at least one of the stories in their region.
That's cool. I love that. So yeah, I mean, I guess kind of talking about Monsanto just got me thinking about, I guess, just colonization in general, because in a lot of ways I feel like that's what Monsanto kind of does in situations like this. But like through that process, it's a really like violent, horrible process that's been going on for a really long time. I know a lot of indigenous people have like really lost a lot of knowledge that was traditionally passed down from like elders on like how to manage the land in these different ways. Do you think like more documentaries like this can help to kind of preserve that and, having it in a recorded format? I know earlier you were saying that some of the people you talked to said that was an issue.
Yeah, I mean, we're certainly trying to inspire more Native people to see what's possible. I mean, that was a big goal for with our partners setting out the, there's this idea in that you can't be what you can't see, and if you grow up not seeing, the restoration of your land management practices and of your culture, and then it's hard for you to really fully believe it can happen. And
totally.
One of the things, a lot of tribal leaders would tell us is, we really want to show people what's possible, especially for the Kirk tribe, bringing back prescribed fire. Only in the past 10 years have they been legally even allowed to do this.
Okay.
This has been illegal for over 150 years. So it's things like that, kind of showing that, these seeds are starting to sprout, and there really is like massive opportunity right now. And the more people know about what's starting to move, especially in certain regions, the Blackfeet tribe runs this bigger program called the Intertribal Buffalo Council. So they're bringing buffalo back to other tribes too, and they're trying to repopulate a lot of the plains just through kind of the tribal reservation network, and really pushing this effort to restore buffalo, as a wild animal, but also as a food, because buffalo are not domesticated. I mean, people I think it's hard to wrap your head around too, things that are really outside Western culture. Like Blackfeet have this relationship with buffalo, but they're not a domesticated animal. They're completely wild still. And the way they farm them and manage them, it's tending the wild. They let them range on thousands of acres, and essentially harvest them, some of them once a year. So I mean, it's much more in line with tending a wild system than it is with highly managed farming.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. I didn't know that, because I just always assumed that, if you were like ranching buffalo or farming buffalo or whatever, it was kind of like cows, but it sounds like not so much.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a good point. I mean, one of the kind of the threads we're looking at in the film is this: we're not just, there's kind of this land stewardship restoration, but also how is that kind of clashing with or meeting with the effects of climate change. And when you talk about buffalo and in terms of and cows, so cows have completely erased where the buffalo used to be is now almost all cows and corn and soy, and they believe there was around 60 million buffalo when the first colonizers landed here,
Wow.
And today there's a couple 100 million cows, I think. And the problem with cows is they are not resilient in any way in terms of climate. They cannot handle the heat, they cannot handle the cold. A lot of cows die off in severe winters. Buffalo can go days without drinking.
Wow.
And they have this really thick fur that falls off. So they actually shed fur seasonally.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, which is really, I mean, a cow has no fur. It doesn't shed. It doesn't thicken up, so they're kind of helpless. And, it's not their fault. They're from, cows are from like India, the water buffalo. They're a totally different, it's just kind of like an inappropriate use of, that animal across the plains, which the plains are severe, really intense winter, really intense summer.
Yeah.
So, I think it's not just about restoring a traditional practice, but it's also about thinking about, and these native species like buffalo and these native plants that know how to be here and do really well here. So I think
Yeah.
it's just so many, reasons to want to support these, projects.
Yeah, totally. And also, you mentioning that until I think you said the past 10 years that it was actually illegal for the tribe in California to do prescribed burns. And as I've been learning more about this topic, it's just been really eye-opening to see how many practices like that were outlawed and actually were illegal. So when I say things like colonization led to, like a lot of knowledge being lost about this kind of stuff, like it was literally illegal to do a lot of things. Like I think foraging was illegal in a lot of places, or still is actually. I know it's illegal to forage on like federal property, like in national parks, I think. But there's this other podcast that I listen to a lot called Ologies with Allie Ward, and she recently had a guest on there who's, I guess, kind of like a TikTok sensation now, but her username is like at Black Forager, and she's this young woman who lives in Ohio, and her whole thing is just going on TikTok and foraging through the woods. And
I love her. I love her work. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you're familiar with her. Yeah, but she was like talking about in that interview how, like a lot of the laws that we have around that now are, and this is in the case of Black people, not Indigenous people, but I'm assuming there's a lot of parallels there that, a lot of those laws were put in place to keep people like her from, living off the land essentially, and from like trying to like assimilate them, so to speak, into, so-called American culture, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, if people, I don't know how many people know this, but the reason why the buffalo were killed off to almost down to 500 from 60 million in the course of about 100 years, it was done by the U.S. government to control the Plains tribes.
Yeah.
Because, they basically had one main food source, which was the buffalo. And, and I think that is symbolic of how the U.S. has treated the land across the whole country in terms of, tactics for control and domination, usually is wiping out a food source to control people and to control a place, and then replacing that ecosystem with grain, with corn or soybean.
Yeah.
It was wheat back then, and but it's this kind of it's this theme that continues on, and manipulating the land to have it be what you want it to do.
Yeah.
And that tends to lead to climate change.
It
kind of comes full circle. I mean, the plains themselves are one of the most important carbon sequestration sinks in the entire North America.
Yeah, grasslands
so by
a ton of carbon.
removing the buffalo an amazing amount, and then plowing the whole plains up, they release. The Dust Bowl was like one of the biggest releases of carbon, and the colonization actually, is the beginning of climate change.
Yeah,
so,
totally.
I mean, it's important to see those layers. I think for us, as non-native people, we're just continuing to learn all this and see how the trajectory of colonization is really, that's where climate change, the story begins. It's really like the complete, disruption and altering of the landscape.
Yeah,
and
totally.
That's, it's a lot of what our film is about, is kind of looking at that history in all these different regions.
That's great. I mean, that kind of makes me think about the title of the film itself, talking about like native species and being native to a place. How did you land on the title Inhabitants?
Yeah, so, a theme that kept coming up, or a phrase, and was kind of this phrase, original inhabitants. And I think that's a really powerful, because I think it says a lot, and it kind of, there's so much story there. And the first film I made was called Inhabit, and I realized it was kind of a thread building of, Inhabit is kind of about permaculture and kind of this new generation of people trying to figure out, how do we live in this region, and Inhabitants is kind of this next step. And for me, it's kind of this evolution of thinking of like, but how do we go back and actually support native people and look at what they're doing, and take their guidance seriously, and put them at the front of the stage. And so for me, it's kind of an evolution of my own thought process. And I think for people, if you watch the film, like if you watch Inhabit, then you watch Inhabitants, I think there's kind of a thread between the two.
Cool. I like that. Yeah, and that was another thing that really struck me about the film was just how much it seemed like there was just so much intentionality about collaborating with Indigenous people for this film. You know, like one of the producers of the film, I think I'm saying his name right, Ben Alex Dupree, is that how you say it?
Yeah.
I know that he's a member of the Colville Confederated Tribes up in the Pacific Northwest. Like, why was this aspect of making the film so important to you? Like, what was that like?
Yeah, so we came into the film knowing a couple tribal project leaders, basically, and you know, we talked to them about coming out to film their projects. And as we met more people, you know, we realized that we don't, you know, and you know, being non-native people, being outsiders, you know, it's not for us to say the best way these stories can be told. We don't know all of the aspects of, you know, what things might be more sensitive, you know, what things might be more effective to help. So we really wanted to do this collaboratively because, you know, we weren't part of the communities and we wanted them to feel like it was going to be helpful, you know. And so we had kind of this transparent process of like, well, we're going to send you our edit and, you know, just give us feedback or edits and give us notes. And if there's anything you want to see different, just let us know. And I think for a lot of filmmakers, that sounds crazy. That sounds like a nightmare. And I mean, you know, it sounds like really difficult. And it, you know, on some levels, there was some challenges to it, but it made it feel really a lot more like a group project instead of like showing up and extracting something from a community, which is what a lot of journalism and media tends to do with Native communities. And we're very aware of that and really trying to make sure people felt excited about what we were doing. And so there was a big process of kind of, you know, getting feedback, and it was really helpful. You know, there's things, we did make a few mistakes, you know, and we took some stuff out. We had this like archival footage that we thought was really like ironic because it was the United States government being like pretty racist about Native people like living lightly on the land, and then the white man came and did, you know, there's so many interesting archival films that the US government has made that are intensely racist and like unbelievably, you know, recent, you know, I mean, 30s and 40s, but it's shocking, you know. And so we had a couple things in there that we thought were like ironic and interesting, but it, you know, people felt like they really wasn't helpful, and it might trigger and confuse Native youth, especially. And, you know, so it was really helpful to have this tribal advisory board to really help us create something that they felt good about. So I would, I mean, definitely recommend for other filmmakers looking to work with Native communities, you know, figure out a way to have accountability and, you know, Native people getting to watch the film as you're working on it and really working together. Because at the end of the day, like, you know, we need to form allyships, and we just need to all work together. And, you know, as Ben Alex Dupree says, you know, in the perfect world, this would be made by Native filmmakers, and it'd be everything would be Native crew and Native led. But we're not in that world, and you know, there's so many stories to be told, and there's so many privileged people like us who have cameras and can help. But it's how do we do that step of just working together and really just listening and, you know, being allies. So it's hard, but you got to have a lot of time. You just got to be able to offer a lot of time, and just do a lot of listening and working together.
That's cool. Yeah, I think I heard someone a few days ago say that a lot of documentaries are actually just like watching an op-ed piece. So it seems like this was not like that at all, which I think is really good. So I love that there's like that aspect to it.
Almost every community we visited, you know, they've experienced a lot of people showing up for a day or 2 days or even like 2 hours and like capturing what they think the story is and kind of getting it wrong and maybe like exaggerating some parts that make it more sellable. So, you know, we spent like a couple weeks to a couple months with each community, and we always went back, and you know, people were surprised when we came back. They're like, oh, you did come back, like you did come to this really important event, like you did. So I think, you know, the most important thing, again, you can offer is just time and being able to really show up and hang out and not be in a rush.
Yeah.
Really
cool. So I was going to ask, I'm currently reading this book, Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. She's a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, believe in upstate New York. But in the first chapter,
I love Robin.
Yeah, she's so good. But I was reading the first chapter a few weeks ago, and she wrote, for all of us, becoming indigenous to a place means living as if your children's future mattered, to take care of the land as if our lives, both material and spiritual, depended on it. And that kind of got me thinking, like, can anybody become indigenous? Like, is that an idea that you came across when you were making this film? Just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's certainly an idea I've heard in a lot of non-native circles and kind of debated about. I think because the word indigenous, the definition of it is pretty contested. It doesn't have any strict numbers, or like it's not defined in a way that can be it can be a bit stretched. So I think it's kind of created a little bit of room for debate around who can be indigenous and how long does it take till you're indigenous. And I mean, you know, and I think I understand why that people are talking about it in that way. Personally, myself, I think the word is similar to the First Nations or original inhabitants.
Okay, I see.
And I think we wouldn't necessarily want to argue who could be, you know, like what would it take for us to be called First Peoples?
Yeah.
You know, and I'm not trying to say like no one could ever become indigenous. I just think it's a little bit irrelevant right now because there's hundreds of native communities still facing the effects of colonization.
Yeah.
And, environmental pollution and mining and oil pipelines that are spilling literally everywhere across the Midwest. And I think there's so many issues that Indigenous people face right now that I find it a little bit odd that I'm hearing that question a lot. Yeah. And I think it's because, we really do. I think a lot of, non-native people want to help and want to be good land stewards and want to connect to the land that they live on. But I think personally that language is just not necessarily helpful right now.
I see. Okay.
But I do think there's maybe like what I think Robin is speaking to really, or also, and I think is what hits me when she writes is kind of like, can we all become land stewards?
Yeah.
And I think that's like definitely yes. And if that's what indigenous means to some people, then maybe that's helpful,
Mm-hmm.
I think the word indigenous just right now is still so charged with history that I don't think we can easily swap it around. And I guess for me, we're coming off of like a few years now of doing so much reading of history and really diving into kind of the background of just 5 tribal communities, and there's over 580 tribal communities or tribes in this country. Mm-hmm. And that's just the federally recognized. There's a lot more that have not been federally recognized. So there's so much culture and there's so much history to be learned just in this place, and I think it's a lifetime of learning. But again, I think we can all be land stewards. We just got to start to learn about who lives, in our region and who's lived here before, and what how can we support them and learn from them. Yeah,
gotcha. That's a good answer. I was following up on that a little bit. This was from the same chapter, another quote, if you don't mind me sharing it. But again, this was Robin Wall Kimmerer. She was paraphrasing an agricultural ecologist named Gary Nabin, I think is how you say his name. She said, we can't meaningfully proceed with healing, with restoration, with restoration. In other words, our relationship with land cannot heal until we hear its stories, but who will tell them? So in part of that, speaking to Native peoples, like getting to know them, learning from them, and like learning a lot of the history and the context around all of this. Do you think like filmmaking has a big role to play in that?
Yeah. majorly big role.
Mm.
I think we're in a time right now where media really tells a story
Yeah.
of our time, and it also like informs us of what's possible, what's happening, and it's like kind of this futurism of like what could happen
Yeah.
and what could shape. And I mean, it's interesting, and there's a lot of there's a lot of care that needs to be put into it, because the first documentary ever made was white Europeans filming northern indigenous people. I think it was called Nanook of the North,
Yeah. I think I
and it
read about
was
that.
this very anthropological, very racist scientific um, gaze at Native people as if they were a specimen to be studied.
Yeah.
So documentary has a dark history, as does
Mm.
photography and science and all these things, that are tools, but
Right.
it's definitely something to be aware of. There's a really famous photographer named Edward C. Curtis who traveled
Okay.
around the United States taking thousands of photographs of Native people, and he would set them up in their traditional clothing and take these very staged photographs of their
Okay.
life, even that life had been completely disrupted. It was like
Mm.
he was trying to preserve something, what he thought, before they disappeared. And
Mm.
there's a huge backlash to his work, because it really was trying to pigeonhole Native people in this romantic moment, and
Yeah.
not who they really were and what they were really going through. So I think it's again, like every tool, it's a double-edged sword, and we need to definitely be just willing to really learn all aspects of what media can do, and how
Mm-hmm.
we can be helpful, because I think it's an ongoing process that we're definitely continuing to go through as filmmakers
Yeah.
ourselves. And the story is so important, and by having I think the big lesson for us is like the more people you can have involved, the more the story is going to be benefiting the greater community.
Mm-hmm.
Because although we want to just say we have our own vision, I think that's where we can get into trouble with
Yeah.
when we're telling other people's stories. I think we just need to be more collaborative.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it makes me think of I feel like recently there's been kind of a reckoning with John Muir and like a lot of his writing, and just the whole conservation movement that happened with, when Teddy Roosevelt was in office. But I think it was the Sierra Club, which John Muir founded or co-founded, I believe. But
Yeah.
they put out a statement last year or sometime in the past couple of years saying, like explaining the racist history that he had and like some of the awful things that he wrote about Native people. And we know him, or a lot of people, I should say, know him for, like the mountains are calling and I must go. And, like these little like cute Instagram quotes like that.
Mm-hmm.
But there's really a lot more to it than that. And you think about him, he's such like an iconic, figure in like nature writing, I guess, and the conservation movement. But yet there's still this dark history to it. So yeah, I think just being cognizant of that is super important.
Yeah. I mean, you bringing up a really good point, and that's a whole other documentary that
Yeah,
needs to be made. And
totally.
I've thought about it, and there's maybe a way to do it in a big collaborative process. People like John Muir and Leopold, and
Yeah.
there's this huge movement of white men, coming into North America and believing that. Basically creating this idea of the wild.
Yeah, no,
The
totally.
concept of the wild in itself
Like the
is
transcendentalist too, a
um,
little bit, I guess.
yeah. I mean, so when the North America when North America was first colonized, the settlers came in and they said, wow, this is a beautiful, like, across the Northeast, they called it in their journals, they called it a park-like landscape.
Yeah.
There was
Mm-hmm.
open meadows, and there was productive trees. And they didn't understand that, for thousands of years, people were doing prescribed burning. They were
Yeah.
breeding trees. They were planting trees. They were creating
Mm-hmm.
food forests. They couldn't see the farming. They couldn't
Yeah.
see the forest management, because it was so foreign to them.
Mm-hmm.
So they thought they were in a wild landscape. And
Mm.
so, the way they took land from Native people, there was a law that actually stated that if the land was not being um, if the land was not being used in a productive way for
God.
agriculture
Yeah.
or other products, it could be taken because it was wild.
Hmm.
It was unmodified, and they couldn't actually. The only thing they could see was if forest was turned into
Yeah.
fields of wheat. They couldn't see native management. They couldn't see wild tending. They
Yeah.
couldn't see all the complex systems happening across the country. So you have people like John Muir and Leopold leaving this legacy of like, oh, this wild landscape that needs to be
Hmm.
preserved, and then you have the national parks, which are basically, essentially these ghost towns of
Yeah.
these landscapes where there would be thousands of native people living,
Mm-hmm.
and there's, like you're saying, there's this reckoning right now of like, how do we bring native people back to the parks, and how do we maybe give some of them land back, but and there's just so much tension because these parks are these billion-dollar industry, and
Yeah.
they're starting to be, the curtain's starting to be drawn, like these are people's homes and these are
Yep.
people's traditional territories. And there's the Havasupai tribe like right in the center of Grand Canyon, and that live next to that really famous waterfall, and people
Hmm.
get the permit to go hike in there, and it's like this one example
Yeah.
of being able to see tribal people living in what we call a park.
Yeah.
So it's
That
it's
used
a
to be their
really
homes.
interesting yeah, I think it's a really interesting time for a lot of
Hmm.
these conservation movement to really you know have the curtain drawn on all of this
Yeah. Totally.
history,
Some reckoning.
and kind of have to re-examine who these people were that we call these conservation heroes. And
Hmm.
there's this kind of racist angle to a lot of it. And
Yeah.
and
Totally.
what are the next steps really to, like, how do we bring native people back into management of national parks, because that's what they were
Hmm.
doing until we called them a park.
Yeah. I mean, I think I first heard about it with Yosemite, but yeah, there's like a lot where that happened, and I agree. Definitely, we need to figure out a solution to that, and at least
Yeah.
like recognize the history behind it and move forward from there. But
Yeah,
um,
Yosemite's a great example because they moved the tribe there, like 100 miles over or
hmm
something. Like, they're pretty close, but they're far enough away that you'd never know they exist.
yeah,
And they were doing prescribed burning in Yosemite Valley
sure,
continuously to create all this great forage for elk and all
mm,
the animals there, and also to keep the wildfire out.
yeah,
And now Yosemite's burning, and of course they haven't been doing management. So it's hopefully, as this climate change ramps up wildfires and
yeah,
drought, hopefully that will push the bigger culture to kind of accept some of this
yeah,
history.
yeah, totally. Um, yeah, that got me thinking. Kind of like like as we're starting to reckon with that now, and like how are we going to tell these stories? There is a quote from another Native writer that I came across that I thought was appropriate for that, and that's from Joy Harjo of the Muskogee Creek Nation. She's a U.S. Poet Laureate right now. But I read her memoir, Crazy Brave, last year, and I loved it. But she has this part in that book where she says, the commercial aspect of stories threatens the diversity of the world's stories and manners of telling. The television stands in the altar space of most of the homes in America. It is the authority and the main source of stories for many in the world. And that seemed just especially appropriate because we're talking about Orca film. But then also the producer of this film, Ben Alex Dupree, I was reading an interview that y'all recently had with Civil Eats, online magazine, I guess. And he said the commodification of indigenous narratives has existed for as long as film has. So I was wondering, like, from your perspective as a filmmaker, how do you keep from commodifying, I guess, like indigenous narratives in this way that he's referring to? And like, how do we begin this work of reckoning, I guess, without commercializing it and kind of warping the story?
Yeah,
It's a
yeah,
big
it's a
question,
really good
but yeah,
question. And it's I don't have all the answers.
sure.
And I think it's important to remember, like, nobody has the answers. I think it's a long process of how do we work with Native communities to support them
Mm-hmm.
and not take away from them.
Yeah.
And I think I think one thing that we need to do is just learn how to be really humble. I think filmmakers specifically tend to be a little bit, controlling about what they think they want to do or what they want to,
Sure.
and I've had that in myself too. And I think, when you're dealing, especially with Native communities, it's so important to remember like that, you're coming into their world and you're trying to help, but they might not necessarily want help from you.
Yeah.
There's a really awesome Native scholar named I can't remember her name right now, but she recommends asking yourself like, can I help if at all?
Yeah.
And asking the communities like, can I help if at all?
Okay.
And I think that's really important because we might think we can always be helpful in every situation or stories we hear about, but maybe like that's not the most helpful thing.
Sure.
So our process, and I'm not saying this is across the board, but our process was first meeting people in the conference space who were already giving presentations about their projects. So they were people who already really wanted to share publicly what they were doing.
Okay.
And then through them asking, who else in the community might be interested in sharing.
Gotcha.
So I think you can run into trouble when you kind of just go off and try and aggressively kind of ask people questions and kind of try and force something. But if you have the time, if you have the years and you have, slowly build relationships and just put feelers out there about who might be interested in sharing, and just let it happen naturally. I think a lot of media creation is happening at a really high speed right now. And I think we lose a lot of that really important relationship building that takes many years. So I think slowing down and building the relationships first, and then I think the filming comes later.
Yeah, totally. Not just like rushing in with an agenda already in mind, kind of like you were saying with some of the other film projects or I guess TV segments that get made about this subject. Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, and it seems like this is an area where there like is starting to become a lot more interest. I think because of climate change, because we've gotten to a point where we've realized like, oh shit, like we can't keep doing this. Like we're literally going to go extinct if we keep doing this. And we have to, like figure out more sustainable ways to manage the land and, grow our food and that sort of thing. And in February of last year, I read this article that was in Scientific American. It was called Indigenous Lands Ace Biodiversity Measurements. And it was about this study that it actually wasn't done in the United States, but it was done partially in Canada, but also Brazil and Australia. There were like, I think it was 15,000, I think it was different areas that these researchers had studied land that was either managed exclusively or co-managed by Indigenous people. And they found that like in almost every case, biodiversity went up when Indigenous people were managing this land. So, I mean, obviously you made a documentary about this very topic. Do you think that, more people are starting to realize this? And why do you think it's taken so long for that to happen too?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of reasons why it's taken so long. I mean, this country and this culture that we live in has been in such denial of colonization, modern day colonization. It wasn't until 2007 that the last boarding school was closed for, Native children being taken from their parents and being, forcibly, culture removed from them. 2007. I mean, I don't think, and I really had no idea how much it's still happening today in terms of how much these communities have to deal with. And I think our culture has had a huge intentional blind spot around the really violent history of how it was founded. And I think that plays a big role, but I think also we, in terms of like, we're a very like solution oriented culture, and we continually think we're going to invent our way out of problems. And I don't think, because when you invent something, you also make a lot of money. And I think simple
Yeah.
answers to big problems are skipped over because they can't make a lot of money. It's much easier to to understand things through a capitalism lens than it is to understand things through any kind of holistic lens, as
Yeah.
as we all know. So I think it's really in this final hour that we're seeing governmental agencies saying, wow, prescribed fire is kind of important. Maybe we should consult with the Karuk tribe. Maybe we should listen to what the Yurok are doing. It's kind of in these desperate times. That's what it's taken. And I think that's very revealing of how ignorant the governmental agencies have been, and how intentionally how intentional they've been with really kind of pushing away any possibility of Native people to have any type of management power or any type of say in what's happening on on all the public lands, let alone their ancestral lands. And so I think unfortunately, like a lot of things, it's taking like these really it's taking these desperate times are pushing us into a better place on some level.
Yeah, it's I guess now is like a time when it's really starting to become apparent that if you try to run an entire economy on like a profit-based model, like there's just so many things you're going to miss if you're doing it that way. So there are so many important things that don't make a profit, but they're just as important, and hopefully we're starting to realize that a little bit more. I feel like if we, like if the current administration does like what they were talking about doing and making, huge investments in like infrastructure and, getting us off of fossil fuels, basically, that would be like a good example of that. But yeah, this is just so ingrained in our minds. It seems like it's almost impossible to imagine doing anything differently.
Yeah, totally. And I think the Menominee tribe is a really good example of, how do we work within the economic framework, but like in doing so, really like unravel capitalistic values.
Yeah.
So they have more standing timber than they did 200 years ago, but they've been continuously logging the entire time. And the only way they've been able to do that is because they have, I think it's over 15 species of trees. They're using that native ecosystem diversity to their advantage. That they also aren't making a lot of profit. They're basically making enough to continue, to sustain, and they've been able to employ like hundreds of people on the reservation in the business. But they also see that the value of a healthy forest is equally as valuable as getting, if not more valuable, it is as making a profit from it. So their whole kind of methodology is like, okay, we need, our sawmill needs to be able to deal with like 15 different types of trees. Most sawmills, it's like one type of tree is everything is designed around. They're like, no, we have to be able to deal with 15 types of trees because we have a ecosystem health plan for the forest. And whatever we have to cut for that plan, that's what we're going to mill and then sell. So they have this advantage of being like, we have a diversity of hardwoods, but we don't have an insane amount of one thing. So when the market goes up on pine, for example, most companies like, okay, now we just cut all our pine. And it's like, we can't do that because we have a ecosystem health plan. We have a management plan. So, I mean, they're a really good example of kind of how do you fit into this framework of, the current economy, but then kind of design it to say, well, we still have a healthy forest. We don't care about what the economy wants us to do, which is plant a monoculture. We're not stupid. We know the healthy forest also gives us deer and all types of wild foods, wild medicines. It has, so many other important aspects for fish, for river health, for swimming, all the different things that, happen in an ecosystem. So they're a really great example. And, there's others, but I think it's really cool and just so humbling to look at, how Native communities have adapted to this like Western economy that's been forced on them. And they've been able to, figure out, in some cases, they've been able to figure out really incredible, ways the rest of the world could learn from.
Yeah. It's a much more like holistic view of economy, of thinking about what that word means. And I
Totally.
think
Totally.
that's great.
You know, they want to make a living without trashing the place, basically.
Imagine that.
Yeah, and I think also because they use the forest so much culturally, for so many reasons, that they're like, of course we're not going to clear cut and just plant red pine for miles. We like really care about this place, and I think for the rest of the country, like we're so disconnected from where our resources come from that of course we don't care.
Yeah.
We have no direct relationship with it. It's hard to care when you don't have a direct relationship with something. You know, and that's understandable. But I think, you know, because Native communities really live in, you know, within the resources that they use or have turned into economic, you know, businesses, that they have a really intimate connection with that, you know, land base. And therefore they're like, we don't, you know, we're not going to trash it. And that's just kind of course, it makes so much sense. And I think if we all kind of understood or could live closer to or have greater connections with where our resources come from, we'd be like, why would we trash it?
Yeah.
'Cause then we lose, even though we made some money. So it's, yeah, there's so much inspiration out there, you know, and it takes, you know, the Menominee community is so busy doing what they do. They don't have a lot of time to advertise themselves. You know, they're just trying to make ends meet doing this like very sustainable forestry. So, you know, it took a lot of time to kind of like make time to set up some interviews, but they all were really excited about sharing, really excited.
Yeah.
You know, but also really busy and don't have time to do TED Talks. You know, I mean, it's another world of like really trying to make it work. So, you know, I think we can all benefit from just, you know, going out of our way to try to learn from these, you know, these communities.
Yeah. Which is why I think it's really important that people like you are making documentaries like this now, because it's like at the time when we needed to be reconnecting to like the land the most, it's like we're the most ill prepared to do that now, because we live in, you know, a society where stuff comes to you from all over the world. Literally, like you can go to the grocery store and buy shrimp and like look in the back and it comes from Argentina or something. And you're like, I thought this would have just come from like the Gulf of Mexico, because it's right there. But so you lose this connection because it's not close to you. And yeah, I think if we can see it, you know, in the format of a film or whether that's a book or whatever, then that helps a little bit to like help us realize that, you know, we're more connected than we maybe realize we are.
Yeah. And we're not alone. You know, I think what we realize and like what's so important to remember is that, you know, Native communities have been here for millennia, which is multiple thousands.
Yeah.
And they know how to live in these places, you know, and their cultures have been deeply disrupted. But there is a lot of, you know, wisdom that is intact and there's a lot of people who are ready to be, you know, have more power as guides and as, you know, allies and working together, because for Menominee, for example, their reservation is a square of green around thousands of square miles of cleared farmland. There's this square of forest. If you look on a map, on a satellite map, you can see them from, you know, from space.
Yeah.
It's like one of the only reservations you can make out from space because it's a perfect square of forest.
Yeah.
And NASA actually used their edge of their reservation to focus their satellites at one point because it was such a clear line between where their reservation ends and where industrial agriculture begins, you know.
That's nuts.
And, you know, I think as we traveled around the country and met with more Native communities, it was this constant reminder to us that, like, no matter what region you're in, there are tribal communities who know so much history and know so many ways to live in that place sustainably.
Yeah.
And the fact that they're alive today is like proof of that.
Yeah.
You know, and we have a long way to go to humble ourselves to, you know, to ask them to help us and teach us and work with them, you know. And it's the fine line between like, okay, I learned something and I take it away and now I do it over here.
Yeah.
Between like, okay, like you're teaching me and I'm going to work with you and I'm going to stay in relationship with you.
Yeah.
You know, and I think it's something we all have to figure out. But like you're saying, it's just such an important time to connect to the land base.
Mm-hmm. And that is something that I kind of worry about a little bit when I hear people talking about, how I guess like Western society needs to learn from indigenous cultures, or like industrialized society needs to learn from indigenous people. Is I guess that kind of appropriation of like, okay, like thanks for teaching us, we're gonna take it now. But it really needs to be like a dialogue and a two-way thing, and we didn't come up with these methods of doing it. These people who have been here for over 10,000 years did, and I don't know.
Totally.
Like, I don't know how we do that respectfully, but I'm wondering if you have any ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily know either, but I have a sense that it needs to start with, first figuring out how do we give Native people more land back that was taken from them.
Yeah, totally.
And how do we give, how do we start restoring and repairing, their own sovereignty, which has been taken from them in a lot of cases. Yep. And I think the like teaching us how to do practices maybe comes at the end of like a longer list of, how do we empower, tribal communities, and how do we get them more access to their ancestral territories. The Kirk tribe, for example, is surrounded by 1 million acres of their ancestral territory, but they don't have a single acre to their tribe because the United States government never ratified their treaty because gold was found in the hills and then other minerals and other mining. So every time they want to burn, they have to apply for a burn permit and an air clearance and all of these different processes with, the forest rangers and with like CAL FIRE. So, I mean, they've been in that Klamath River Valley for thousands of years. They know what they're doing, and yet they have to jump through endless hoops to do a small scale burn in a small part of the forest. So, I think that's where it needs to start, is how do we really shift that power structure back to tribal communities, and then how can they teach us in a way that really works together, like you're saying. And we definitely have a long way to go, but as you're saying, like as more people become aware and more people in the right places in the higher levels of government agencies, I think that's when we're going to start seeing more change and more restoration.
Yeah. That's such a great way that he did a play on words like that. I loved that. And I guess I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that last year, Deb Holland was elected to Secretary of the Interior for the United States, and that was such like a huge moment for Native people. I felt like, did you see any, I guess, effects of that you could see when you were making the documentary, or just we need more of that?
Yeah, certainly. We heard a huge amount of excitement across the board, around Deb Holland being, Interior, and that's never been a Native person, I've never had that role, and that it has such a huge impact on mining contracts, on development of tribal territories, on environmental pollution, environmental racism. So it's a huge step, and it's long overdue. But I think people feel like there's going to certainly be a massive, more protection of land, but also more funding for traditional land management. So it's a huge step, and I think we're going to see, a lot of big effects over the next few years.
Yeah. I was also going to ask, when I was, I guess, poking around on the film's website before we started talking, I noticed there was a tool where you could go to a map and like enter your address, your zip code or whatever, and it would tell you what native land you're living on. And I think it's important to mention that this podcast currently, where I'm talking to you from, is made on what is traditionally Cherokee and Muskogee land, depending on, like where you see where the border is. But I was curious to hear your take on why you think it's important for people to, learn that history and find out what land they're actually living on.
Yeah, awesome. I'm glad you found that resource. Yeah, so here's a great, amazing tool to actually start to figure out what tribal land do you live on, who is the tribe, you know, that used to be there or may still currently be there, you know, where are they now, and how can you support what they're doing now, and how can you learn from them? You know, the Cherokee and a lot of the southern tribes were, of course, moved into the Midwest. You know, the Cherokee, along with a bunch of tribes, were forced to walk to Oklahoma, 800 something miles.
It's
you know,
long
so I
ways from
think,
here,
the Trail of Tears, and you know, I think what that map does is it just blows open so much history that's literally where we're sitting, and helps us to realize that we're like where we are is there's so much story under our feet in this place. There's so much to know, and there's so much happening currently with those tribal communities that, you know, you can directly support, whether that's through, you know, donations or just through sharing their stories or going and visiting their events or just showing up and talking to people. So I think that map is like a really great launch board, you know, for a whole different array of things you can do as an artist or as a journalist or, you know, as anyone who wants to maybe interact with that community and try and be of help in some way.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Because I was curious about that. So I'm glad you said that. Yeah. And then I guess we're kind of coming up on time here, but I know that the film is going around right now, and I think it premiered in March. Is that right? At a film festival?
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, like, is there going to be a time when just the general public can watch it? And if so, like, where can people find it?
Yeah, so the film will be publicly available in late November.
Okay.
I think we're scheduling it for like the day before Thanksgiving. So people can, you know, that's Native American Heritage Month in November, you know, so it'd be a really great time for people to kind of dig into some more history and some, you know, some celebration really of tribal communities. And if you follow our website, inhabitantsfilm.com, and, you know, we're on Facebook and Instagram, Inhabitants Film, there's a whole bunch of free screenings we're doing this summer.
Okay.
We have an impact campaign where we're doing a free screening every month along with a virtual panel of a bunch of film subjects focusing on each of the 5 stories in the film. So over 5 months, we're going to have 5 events, and you can follow all that kind of on our website. And there's lots of information on there.
Cool. Awesome. Well, Costa, I think that about answers all my questions that I had. I really enjoyed getting to talk to you. I'm excited to see the film when it comes out. And yeah, thanks for being on the show.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for having me. And, you know, hope everybody gets to check it out and, you know, learn more about where they live and the people who have lived there.